You don't, you don't, you don't. Okay. So you don't? Okay. Because we all had the chance to meet Lucy yesterday. This is a little bit loud, no? It's perfect? We all had the chance to meet Lucy yesterday. And we had also the chance to receive some of her feedback in the studio projects that we are developing at the moment. So and Lucy actually yesterday made a great introduction to herself, which for sure I am not going to do better, but for those of you who don't know her, we're very happy to have Lucy Musgrave tonight. She's a leading practitioner on issues surrounding sustainable communities and urban design. She's the director of Publica, a London-based planning and regeneration consultancy that advises developers, planners, and communities on what makes successful and sustainable neighborhoods and cities. The practice specializes in revealing, understanding, and valuing the existing character of places in order to address change as a positive and inclusive process. Lucy's particular expertise lies in the integration of social and cultural issues of place with spatial master planning. She has played a key advisory role in policy recommendations, strategic planning and urban design frameworks, and in advocacy of design quality. Her approach is marked by a commitment to excellence, international best practice, and delivering change through the active engagement of the widest range of users and social partners. She has championed emerging practitioners and best practice, was responsible for the publication of UK's government-sponsored directories on the best young architects in Britain, and co-authored the Thames and Hudson publication Design and Landscape for People, New Approaches to Renewal. She has been advisory and board member of many institutions. She was the former director of the Architectural Foundation in London, and I had the enormous pleasure to meet her during the Holcim Awards on Sustainable Construction this year. So it was a very nice opportunity to meet you and also to have you here. I hope it's not the first and last time that we will meet here at the Institute, so please help me welcome Lucy again. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Do whatever you want with me. Where that? You could do the arm thing. Can you put it in my pocket? I can talk. Can you hear me? Is it working? Testing. Sorry about it. Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah, fine. Yeah, fine. Okay. Thank you, Marta. Okay, I'll start with this microphone. You happy for me to start? It's working now? Yeah, get hot and I see Sorry. A bit quieter.
Okay, let's try.
Yeah? Is that working now? Yeah. Okay. Apologies for the technical hitches. Marta, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's very nice to see most of you again, meet new people who weren't here yesterday. I really enjoyed meeting you all and seeing your work yesterday. And in fact, what you've been doing in terms of your common project with regards to the superblock, actually maybe you'll recognise some of the themes and some of the issues that we look at in our work at Publica. So I just thought I'd say that the structure of what I'm going to show you tonight is that I'm going to show you, I'm going to talk a bit about the principles of why we do what we do. I'm then going to share with you some questions that we ask ourselves a lot when we're working on master plans. So they're just some big questions, but we think about those questions quite a lot, so I thought it might be useful to just put them up on the screen. And then I thought it might be useful just to go through one case study, just to show you a bit about actually what the methodology is and what the different layers of what we're trying to achieve are. And then the last bit is just talking about practice internationally and how practice is, in my opinion, how practice is changing. So I'm going to start, but then I also wanted to just say that in terms of the images that I'm going to show, the work I'm going to show is Publica's work, but it's also the work of my previous organisation, General Public Agency, and some of the photographs I'm going to show right now are the work of a photographer called Philip Eberling, who we commissioned to work with a lot. He's an amazing photographer. And also some of the big urban landscapes are from a friend and a collaborator called Michael Collins, who runs Records of Picture. Okay, so I think you've kind of got the message that Publica is a public realm consultancy. Our subject is the complexity of urban neighbourhoods, and I call this an unruly subject. It is very unruly. We take a multidisciplinary, let's see if it works. This is a Michael Collins image. We take a multidisciplinary approach involving architecture, planning, environmental and creative regeneration, design, as well as issues of active citizenship. Any neighbourhood is complex. Any neighbourhood story can be told from multiple perspectives. From outsiders, from incomers, from people who think that they know the place, from people who do know it but know it through their own experience. I believe that looking at any urban neighbourhood should reveal contrasts, different perspectives, the contradictions, the different opinions, the assumptions, the projected ideas of what a place is. And all of it is contested the whole time. I really believe this. And we needed to consider what we need to know to meet the challenges as architects and planners, and how to learn what we learn, and what to do with this knowledge. What will the city be? The way we use cities and urban neighbourhoods is changing. The modernist utopias, which were bent on this sort of idealised rationalism, disposing of the unruly subject, as Ralph Rugoff has written, and I believe it's a thing of the past. We no longer see through a single perspective of the finished utopian modernist project. Our lives are complex, they're fast-paced, they're super local, and they're set within much wider global cultures and new avenues of knowledge. The fact of a district lies in what it is internally and in the internal continuity and overlapping with which it is used, not in the way it ends or how it looks from the air. This is Jane Jacobs speaking, okay? And this sweeping view of the paternalistic planner has been replaced with an investigation of the intricacies and the vitality of everyday places. So the Michael Collins very large format images of London, of the cityscape, were shown in City Hall. There was an exhibition of these huge images on the wall of City Hall. And when Michael took down the frames, he found that they were covered in the marks of people's fingerprints. And this was really interesting to him and also to us. The photographs are very detailed, and people seem to talk at these images and talk and point and go into these images in more and more detail. And this idea about how you frame something, what you recognize, and how you share it as a conversation, and you rethink landscapes, urban landscapes, you often rethink what is discounted. In fact, in my opinion, nothing is discounted. We think is really interesting. So we try to rediscover value and opportunity and reveal the lived culture of London, the social infrastructures, the way people spend their time, their social networks, and we follow the advice of digging deep where you are, looking at the intimate spaces of a neighbourhood as part of the symbolic aspect of the public realm, so that the civic realm isn't just the public buildings. Actually, it's much, much wider than that. Successful urban neighbourhoods have always been made up of diversity of building stock and have aged and been rebuilt in continuous patterns of renewal and the balance and fluctuations of land values. And I'm going to read you another quote. It's from 1971. It's talking about a particular neighbourhood in London. The main characteristic of the area is its mixture. Its component parts are scattered widely, yet the area is compact. When looked at closely, it's rather like looking at a newspaper photograph, all random dots and seemingly without reason. Land tenures mixed with freehold, long, short-hold leaseholds, tenancies all jumbled up. There's no single area of consolidated land ownership. Much investment has taken place in building in the past 20 years, and this too has been piecemeal, cheek by jowl with older, worn-out properties. It's a quote from a 1971 study of a place called South Shoreditch, just north of the City of London, and the idea at the time was to completely raise this area as an area of comprehensive redevelopment. But the author, Michael Tice, suggested that the building stock was robust. He didn't know what the economic relationship would be with new industries and how these buildings would be used and how this neighbourhood would be used. But he argued passionately that there was a future for actually retaining this neighbourhood, and it's true. And now it's what they call Silicon Roundabout, and sort of this place called Hoxton and South Shoreditch. You might have heard about it. So a resurgence in the spirit of, in a way, what Michael Tice was arguing, I think is happening in urbanism today, whereby the strengths of the stock and the assets of a particular place are reassessed, and that has to, I think, be a new influence in practice. So rather than actually thinking about the finished result, it's about the process itself, the process of change. So this idea about the symbolic and the functional aspects of the public realm, and how we look at the process of characterization and how this can be built into decision making in architecture and development and in planning is our subject. So what do we actually do? Well, we work on large master plans. We are asked to revitalise the public space in some of London's very historic districts for the great estates, people who have long-term interests in those parts of London. We look at relatively new developments and how to make them more successful. And we also look at housing estates, social housing estates, and we work for community organisations to look at actually this process of change and how they need to actually, what they need to know and what that process of change might be. So I think, as I explained to lots of you yesterday, we're set up as this thing called a community interest company and a consultancy. And what we actually do is we conduct very detailed surveys to attempt to understand the physical, the social, the cultural, the symbolic landscapes of place, often where change is anticipated or planned. Our team is made up of architects, urban designers, planners, researchers, artists, and we gather and we analyse extensive information about a given area, from the physical to the personal to the statistical. Our combination of design advice, engagement, research and strategizing is a rather unusual service, but we pride ourselves on retaining the same integrity for any client, regardless of whether it's a private sector developer or a planning authority or a community group. Our survey methods range from fine-grained analysis of roads, paving, architecture, character, information gathering on about how and how much a place is used at different times of the day, mapping of cultural, retail, community provision, research into the history of a place, such as the demographic fluctuations, political events, historic character, recent cultural changes, identification of landmarks, character, desire lines. We assemble a team with local participants on our team to support our field work and also to help with very detailed studies. And we include creative approaches. We make films, we ask other people to make films for us, we build up this layered kind of intelligence base of our portraits of our surveyed areas. We conduct interviews and we do walks with local people in order to understand their ideas, their aspirations, their frustrations. We look at other case studies. We look at case studies in London in terms of similar neighbourhood things, about ideas about successful design strategies and also unsuccessful design strategies. To be honest, we learn more from unsuccessful schemes than we do from successful schemes. And all of this grew out of a methodology that I've been building up over the last kind of 10, 15 years about social and cultural surveying and what it might mean in terms of developing that into a public realm strategy. These social and cultural participative surveys are important because the patterns of occupation are changing. We began to talk about this quite a lot yesterday. They're changing very rapidly in our cities throughout the world. And particularly, I think, because of the economic crises of the West at the moment. And I think that this will continue to accelerate as a moment of change. So who actually lives somewhere? We've been working on a housing estate in London Borough of Islington. The landlord and the planning authority knew that 1,000 people lived on this housing estate. When we worked there, we found out that 2,000 people lived on this housing estate. So actually, the hidden, what is seen and what is hidden, the hidden 1,000 people on this housing estate weren't taking part in the governance and decision making and the more civic aspect of what was happening in this housing estate, but they were contributing to the economic patterns, the employment patterns, etc., etc. So I think there are some big changes happening in cities. We talked yesterday about the corporate landscape in commercial sectors and how actually that's changing and moving in terms of this overlap between residential districts and commercial districts. This is happening all over London at the moment, where people who were traditionally in the financial district are buying up smaller buildings, are doing much, much more flexible approaches to how they work and what they do. And then we've been looking at other ideas like, for example, in Tokyo, it's quite familiar to find an architectural office in somebody's flat. And actually, the model making is in the bathroom and the archive is, the workshop is on the balcony and, and the clients and the architectural magazines come into the building, but actually it's a residential block. So that's, happening. I think it's happened a lot in other cities, but it's also now happening much, much more in European cities, and certainly in London, which is interesting. So while these adaptive new patterns emerge, radically changing how we and where we live and work, other issues on the larger scale of development processes in London in particular are having a profound impact on the urban landscape of the city, because the flexibility of the city is being designed out. We feel strongly that this flexibility that's required of the 21st century is not being addressed by architects and planners at the moment. So much larger pieces of the city are being assembled and they're being rebuilt in new spatial typologies. They're new lumps of city. They're built in one piece. They're built at one time. They're monocultural and they're shiny. They're this sort of stuck-on cladding. So they're not really allowed to age either. So the idea, the Jane Jacobs idea in terms of actually how we use these obsolete buildings and how, we kind of find luxuries in space in terms of previous generations, actually the inflexibility of the way that we're building cities at the moment is, I think, a real problem for us. We're at the moment asked by a client to look at an estate, a commercial, a business district that was built 10 years ago. It wasn't allowed to age, but the client knows, is very tired. Is not very good. So what can we do to revitalise architecture that's been built 10 years ago? This revisioning process is constant and relentless in all cities, from developers, the architectural profession, from all the money that's pouring into London because of all the other economic crises that are happening all over Europe. There's a lot of money particularly in London at the moment. And yet I think that the revisioning discounts the human activity and the human scale. And if we have these inflexible buildings, actually what changes can we make, really? And I think that's critical. So another quick quote from Jane Jacobs. This is this point about time and obsolescence. Time makes certain structure obsolete for some enterprises and then become available to others. Time can make space efficiencies of one generation the space luxuries of another generation. One century's buildings commonplace is another century's useful aberration. So our work with planning departments, for developers, for community groups, basically provides this intelligence base of needs assessment, and it means we can set the right brief. And the people we work for find it really, really useful. It's partly because they have the materials to set the right brief and they feel more confident in terms of what they're trying to achieve, but it's also they can have a proper conversation with local users because the local users have contributed to the setting of that brief, and therefore they can recognise something and they can have a conversation rather than some spurious public consultation. And I can't emphasise enough how much I believe in the setting of a brief for a project. If the brief is based on good evidence and the understanding of use, character, scale and integration, in my view it must be participative to be actually true, and therefore it's not a fixed thing, the brief. All the developers we work for are interested in how you can bring this approach about brief setting to work with their financial models, the viability of delivering large master plans. And I think that's really interesting in terms of how the private sector is trying to get to grips with this new way of working. And they're also increasingly interested in how contemporary architecture can respond to this approach to brief setting. Personally, I believe it can deliver resourceful, elegant, creative, collaborative solutions. Our office is incredibly busy, mainly working for the private sector, working for some of the best clients in London, and we try to make this balance between who we work for, but I think it's really important that it makes sense, the way that we work, to try to mainstream it to work for the investment community as well as for the architectural and the planning community. So I'm going to, as I say, I'm going to share some questions with you. Who owns public space? Okay, it's a really, really big issue. There's been a big debate about it for the last, 5-10 years. This is the work of the POPs, the privately owned public spaces in New York. So actually, you've got organisations and you've got very live amounts of research and ideas and debate and communication actually about what is happening to the public realm. In London, we've sold off a lot of our public realm. In Barcelona, I don't know the situation, but I think actually this idea about what happens in the public space and who owns it. This is Paternoster Square. It's one of our drawings of Paternoster. We're quite interested in Paternoster Square. It's a really interesting planning battle in central London that Prince Charles was involved in. I'm not going to go into it now, but Occupy London thought that Paternoster Square was public space. It's not public space. It says really clearly it's private, okay? And there's certain people invited onto that piece of open space, and there's certain people who are not welcome. And actually this idea about what we do and what we're allowed to do in terms of appropriating our public realm, I think is a really important issue in planning and regeneration and architecture at the moment. This is the work that we did at King's Cross Central. King's Cross, a huge master plan, 67 acres in the middle of central London, old railway yards. We had I'll talk a bit about it later, but we were very surprised the master planning team hadn't done a wider area survey, so we started looking at this wider area survey. But the reason putting this image up was really to talk about this issue about who also owns the planning system, because actually the planning system in the UK, and certainly in London, has been reliant upon the private sector to deliver development and regeneration and planning. And actually, therefore, here our client was the developer. So the developer, in a way, is using me as a way of filling in all of the intelligence that normally the planners would have. So actually, who also owns this process of, the democratic process of the planning system in terms of what is found out and how that information is used? This is a Nolly plan of the, looking at public space and so forth in this master plan, and also the key links, etc., etc. Now, isn't that interesting? I think it is interesting, the fact that actually how planning is delivered in this decade. I don't know if it's the case here, but certainly in London it's the case. This blurring between the public and the private sector, I think, is very interesting. So how do you create a neighbourhood from scratch? This idea, going back to the Jane Jacobs, about how we use all this stock and how we use this idea about this newspaper dots and how it's all appropriated over time with different business models, different ways of living, etc., etc. But if you've got a really extraordinary place, which is 67 acres, or perhaps even a smaller block, but a whole block right in the middle of the West End, actually, how do you create a neighbourhood from scratch? You've all shown me lots of land use mapping yesterday. We do an enormous amount of land use mapping. We tend to do, we just do the ground floor, and then we do predominant upper floors. And I know lots of you have actually did much, much more detailed layering of actually many, many different stories. But here, it's just looking actually at how this part of London came to be built, what the neighbourhood is made up of, and therefore how can we, in terms of the brief for the master plan, begin to understand this issue of integration. This is a master plan we're working on at the moment. This is just one of, this is Nina in my office, her drawing about character, about how can we understand severance, but also how can we understand what the character is at the moment, how we can build from the infrastructure of the railway and the motorway flyover and the existing communities. And this is, sorry, these are a bit, they can't really see these images so well. They're very sort of, the colours are very bright and a bit, the lights, anyway, it doesn't matter. But this was a study just looking at this part of London called Fitzrovia. If you look at Fitzrovia, every corner in Fitzrovia is a public house, it's a pub. So in the new master plan that we're working on, in the middle of Fitzrovia, perhaps every corner ought to actually be something more civic in terms of thinking about this tradition of how we mark corners of these urban blocks. So you go back and you can see actually that, you know, they're very visible attractors and they have a, you know, they have a wider use. In terms of grain and scale, about understanding in terms of, you know, this issue of scale is really big in London at the moment in terms of actually this different patterns of both, you know, historic environments over many, many centuries, what happens in the 20th century and what's happening today and how people can consider grain and scale. So a place like, this is the Boundary Estate. It was the first social housing that was ever built in Britain. It's in the East End of London. It was built by the London County Council. When they did this master plan, it was actually about understanding what all of the existing street network was and how they could build this new housing. It was built at the turn of the last century, so just at the beginning of the end of the 19th century, how they could build from all of these existing routes to make something that was actually part of the city and more flexible. This is one that was built in the 1970s in the middle of Covent Garden, how they could understand the relationship with the retail and the street, how they could understand the private spaces in terms of the green spaces and the communal spaces and the public spaces throughout. And then this is what they've been building recently in terms of this idea about how does this age? How does this integrate with the connections? This one is a case, I don't know if you can see it, it's this sort of big offer next to Battersea Power Station. The developers made this offer of this really amazing amenity. All of this space in this master plan is going to be for public use. Well, actually, no. There's no connection there. There's no route there, and it's very narrow. And I don't know if you can't really see in this sort of very bright photograph, but actually there's railings everywhere. So it's all about this idea about boundaries all the way through and privacy of these rather expensive flats. And what it does to the street is this image on the left, which is this huge moat around it. It has no connection with the street. So actually this idea about how we create places from scratch overnight in accelerated development mode, I think is a really big challenge at the moment, and something that every architect and every planner ought to be really thinking about. Reclaiming infrastructure. Reclaiming infrastructure, I mean, we talk about this quite a lot because I think that there's an idea which we again touched upon yesterday, and I think is very common kind of parlance in architecture schools, about this idea about layering, about really exploiting the idea of infrastructure. So rather than this hard infrastructure, which is our railway lines and our sewers and our road networks, etc., how can we actually think about other infrastructures like green infrastructures, social infrastructures, etc., and how can we layer this? So you can't see this at all, but this is a really amazing program underneath the flyover that goes, it's called the Westway. It's run by a charity, and really beautiful, beautiful, very quiet landscapes underneath this amazing motorway flyover with just lots and lots of program, basically. And this is interesting, you can't see the image so well, but it's actually next to a railway line. So the terrace housing actually, basically, from the little back gardens, they all have access to this strip of land that is owned by Network Rail, the people who run the railways. And they've appropriated it, and they've created these beekeeping places and all of these community gardens, and everyone has their own little identity along the railway track. So actually, how can we learn from this idea about how people are appropriating space, and how can we build that into much bigger and much more commercial master plans? So what's the social infrastructure? This is our work in Hoxton and South Shoreditch. We did a full survey, and I'll go into the survey methodology later in terms of the case study. But here, in our red line boundary, we just drew a line. We called it the urban slice. And we picked off the urban slice a full demographic sample of ethnicity, social class, gender, incomers, people who lived there for generations, etc., etc. And then we interviewed them, and this became a really, like the meat, the really important part of this survey. And then we found this kid, he was 14, he's called George Edge, and he painted beautifully. So we actually, everyone we were interviewing, we just said, George, could you go and paint their portrait for us? And everyone loved these portraits so much that then actually a local cultural organisation said, could we have an exhibition of this kid's work? And then actually the client liked the survey so much, he said, could we turn it into a book, and when we launch our new building, could we give it to all of these people, all of these neighbours, and maybe the neighbours could start talking to each other. And actually this idea about how we find out about social infrastructure. This is our work on the housing estate I was talking about. This is a Peabody housing estate. It's one of the old and post-war. It's got two parts of it, just north of the Barbican in central London. And here we made films, but we also asked some of the kids on the estate to start making films. We did a series of walks, so we asked people, again, different generations of people to take us on a walk around the housing estate. Surprise, surprise, the walks all ended up in the same place. And then from that, we started having public meetings, and we started actually talking to people about what the principles were of what they wanted to see change on this housing estate. I work with a woman called Lucinda Rogers who draws in public, and what I do, and I've done it for years with her, is that when we have a public meeting, Lucinda just sits and she draws. She talks to people and she draws, and she gives them their drawing. So if you're talking to an old man or a young child about change and about what could happen and what the neighbourhood's like, you see their eyes get bigger and bigger and bigger as they see Lucinda drawing what they are saying. And she then gives them the photo, she gives them the picture. It's the most powerful thing I've ever seen, and we use Lucinda a lot. So this is her work for us on this Peabody housing estate. We're working with her with a university in London, which I'll come on to later on in the case study, which I think is quite interesting. And this is just, at the moment we're working on a big master plan in West London with Eric Parry Architects, and it's about all the social infrastructure. So actually understanding that, although in red and orange and pink up here, there's a housing estate. It's amazing. You see this whole block. There are 4 churches along this they're right next door to each other, all these different denominations of churches, all these different community centres, all these different luncheon clubs, all these food co-ops, all the rest of it. So actually how, in terms of our site, which is an industrial site, cut off by lots and lots of things, how can we begin to draw some of that and learn from some of the people that manage and initiate the energy within this community to start thinking about some of the social infrastructure of our master plan. And how long is a meanwhile use? Now this is a really interesting question because pop-ups have been happening in London a lot recently. Pop-ups, we've been supporting a woman called Heather Ring. She's a really fantastic landscape architect, and she does temporary gardens. She did one with the Architecture Foundation, which was a temporary community orchard, and she runs an organisation called Wayward Plants, and Wayward Plants is an orphanage for unloved plants. So she collects unloved plants and she finds good homes for them. And she did a community orchard for the Architecture Foundation, and then she gave away all the trees of the community orchard to these community groups in Southwark. And she wanted to do a contemporary physic garden, so she asked us to help her, and we helped just by project managing it. And she worked with a hospital, and she set out the whole garden as hospital departments, so all of the different medicinal plants from oncology, cardiology, psychiatry, etc., etc. So there's lots of pop-ups like that happening in London at the moment. It's really interesting. But then we had a client in the private sector who's bought the Athletes' Village of the Olympic Park, and he said, Lucy, I want a meanwhile strategy that will last me 30 years. Now that's interesting. So actually we began to ask this question, actually how long does a meanwhile strategy last? Because actually if you think about the city in flux, the whole lot is actually constantly being revisioned and reinvented and rethought and reused. And we started looking into the RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects asked me to share a talk earlier in the summer, and I started to look at actually, maybe we used to do this quite a lot. So the Fire of London, when the Fire of London happened, they introduced a new tax to the City of London. It was called the coal tax. And they actually gathered a lot of money to rebuild the parish churches of the City of London because they needed places to worship. So actually, if you look back 400 years, we have had more sophisticated taxation and decision-making and governance about temporary buildings and temporary programme than we do in the 21st century. So actually, maybe we need to rethink meanwhile uses, but I've just got some, there are acupunctural interventions. This is in the Olympic Park, which is fantastic, and they can suddenly get people's attention and they can make people see from a different perspective. This is on the roof of the Architecture Foundation by David Cohn. So these little light touch kind of, sort of like Atelier Bow, I would call them pet projects. This is on the top of a car park in Peckham, a completely discounted place where actually it's become the place to go and socialise. But also, some strategies like, in terms of the Ruhr Valley, a project that was an artist project that was supposed to last for 3 months, 10 years on, it's a permanent feature of that landscape and that programme. This is the Cineroleum. Our office is on the back of this. It's a petrol station. It's a disused petrol station on Clerkenwell Road. Our office just on the other side. Maria, who works for us, is part of this collective. They put up a temporary Cineroleum. They made this wonderful cinema in the summer and out of the petrol station. But the idea wasn't just a pop-up. It was that actually all these sites that they identified around London could start to have these programmes. So she's built a partnership of all of these organisations. A place like De Strip in the Netherlands, this is the work of Janne van Heeswijk, where a completely empty row of shops can be turned into a cultural programme that can be part of urban planning, that can be part of a much longer term thinking. So the idea here was to provide, she did them up, she got them for 2 years, but she also got a 10-year programme from the developer of commissioning. So Boymans van Berningen that had never had an outpost, but they actually came here to this little suburban row of shops, and they put up a shop. She gave artists studio space for free on the condition that there were 2 events that happened for local residents in these studios, and it completely changed this suburb of Rotterdam. And, in Potsdamer Platz, this was the biggest pop-up ever, because actually the idea about changing perceptions of the city, this info box came and it had 4 million visitors. No one imagined that it was ever going to attract that audience. So actually this idea about, I just think it's quite good to be provoked in terms of this idea. Is it like my coal tax, where actually it's always happened and we've just got to get more sophisticated at it? Or is it that actually you need to have something much more provocative to change people's ideas about a place? Okay, can we allow for play? I know I'm in Barcelona. I know that this is a very family-friendly city. I've got 4 children. I know a little bit about Barcelona, and I'm very interested in it. But in London, children are not welcome. And we have to ask this question of ourselves the whole time. And in every single master plan, we're working for the City of London at the moment, and everywhere we go, we see the civilising force of children and young people. But that is not how other people generally think about it in London. So you have, regularly all the public space says, what you can't do, everywhere, what you can't do. In the Barbican, where I used to live, if a child went past on a skateboard, an old person would phone up the City of London police. So if you're a young person, and I've got teenagers, actually it becomes quite hostile, this idea about the difference between generations and what's permissible in the public realm. So this is King's Cross. There are lots of when we were asked to work on King's Cross, the developer said he'd become a father. And when you become a parent, actually, you start seeing the city in a very, very different way. And he had these 2 young boys, and he said, Lucy, I want to make King's Cross Central the most child-friendly place in Europe. How will I do it? This is your brief. And I think he thought that he wanted to have this amazing children's museum like they have in Mexico City. They wanted to have this amazing playground. He wanted to have all this amazing offer and this program. And we started looking at King's Cross and saying, well, actually, King's Cross has got quite a lot going for it already. It is a place of incredible industrial archaeology. It's a place that has had this green layering over many decades, so actually it has a landscape quality of its own, and also of illicit pleasure. I mean, this is a place of prostitution in London. I mean, this is kind of, where people come and do illicit things. So actually, maybe we should look at this concept of an urban pleasure garden in a hard landscape in the 21st century, because there used to be an urban pleasure garden in the 18th century on this site, and to think again about some big ideas about how play can become landscape, rather than actually there's a destination over there that is just for children. Maybe it should be wholly cross-generational. And this became part of the master planning process at King's Cross. And it was really exciting. We worked for Roger for 2 years. And I'm not going to use it as a case study, but it was taking, from like Jaime Lerner's, Curitiba examples about thinking about how you can actually do extraordinary things as attractors. This is about a whole series surrounded by 5 housing estates, how you can begin to invite people in, how you can use the old gas holders to we've made the suggestion of this thing called Flux Park, where it was completely open. It just had lockable play equipment. It was called Flux Park because you just come and play your own games. So there's a little bit of infrastructure, the play equipment, a ramp where you can watch, but that's it, it's very loose. Okay, so this is the case study. So Aldgate is it's just on the edge of the City of London, and it's a place which it's this kind of crazy place. People have lots of ideas about Aldgate. No one's quite sure where it is because the tube station got renamed and changed, and there's 2 tube stations now, and actually what was Aldgate as a district and then Whitechapel has become kind of confused in the 20th century. Abercrombie put the inner ring road through it, so there's a lot of kind of highway infrastructure that went through, and it's also symbolically been a very, very charged space. So in 1936, on the 4th of October, there was this thing called the Battle for Cable Street, where Oswald Moses' black shirts, the fascists in Britain, marched through. They didn't come from this district, but they went to this district and marched through it because it had been a place of immigration. So first of all, the Huguenot silk weavers, and then the Jewish community, and all these immigrant communities, and then the Bangladeshi community in the 1960s and so forth. But in the 1936, they came to put a stop to this idea about, it was very, very anti-Semitic. And all of the trade unions and church organisations and community groups and Jewish organisations stood up to them and made a barricade in Cable Street, and it's a very important moment in London's history. And the English Defence League in September of this year went to the same place to walk as fascists again through the Bengali community. So this idea actually that outsiders symbolically see this neighbourhood is very, very charged. So it's quite a complex place. I'm not going to go into the politics of it, but I'm just going to talk about what we do. We started off working for a developer. He had a very, very large site there. He wanted to understand how he could get the right ground floor usage strategy. That's what he wanted. He wanted a good open space strategy, a good ground floor usage strategy. He wanted to make some connections. So we started with one of our social and cultural surveys. I'm not going to go into it, but it just shows everything that we mapped in terms of the categories that we mapped on the right-hand side: arts and culture, community, education, faith, street festivals, healthcare, leisure, shopping, etc. And then we started, following that, we started working for lots of other people in Aldgate. So we worked on his master plan for about 3 years, but we also started working for the planning authorities on a public realm strategy. We started working with the Whitechapel Gallery, who were redoing their building and wanted to do a particular project in a street. We started working for London Metropolitan University in the architecture department, who are moving into the School of Art in this site. So these are updated maps from the 2007 maps, which we did this year, looking at housing, social housing, looking at all the public space and the different typologies of public space, all of the social and cultural provision. And then this was the vision for the public realm strategy. This place, as I say, is 2 big traffic gyratories, one-way systems, being the arterial roads of inner London since Abercrombie instigated this in the 1950s. And the idea was that these 2 big gyratories would come out. They'd go back to 2-way streets. And the 2-way streets was a really interesting thing because it would free up a hectare of potential public realm. And what my developer, who I'd worked for years, was interested in, because he owned quite a lot of property here, was that actually instead of all these developers doing their own bit of corporate front lawn, they were doing these little polite bits of landscaping, which meant kind of nothing in this kind of crazy place. He wanted to see something that would actually make sure that he could market this place as a coherent neighbourhood. So we went to the Mayor of London and we suggested that this developer paid for a public realm strategy that we delivered, and we did it with the 3 planning authorities that work locally. So these are the partners: the City of London, the Planning Authority, Design for London, which is the Mayor's Office for Design, were the lead client. Tower Hamlets, the other planning authority, Transport for London, the third planning authority, and then various local stakeholders, the university, Whitechapel Gallery, etc., etc., and Exemplar, the private sector developer who paid for it. So we set a new red line boundary. The borough boundary is this black line that goes through the middle. And we started looking at policy. We're really interested in policy, in planning policy. We start with planning policy the whole time. And this is our mapping of the policy. Our little black line is our red line boundary in the middle. But that black line, there is a plethora of planning policy at a very local level, but also at a citywide level. So all of these rings represent all of the different planning policy. And because we were working for the 3 planning authorities, we need to ensure that they understand we're building from their existing planning policy. We're not sort of cutting it up and saying, okay, that's out the window, let's start again, we've got better ideas about planning. It's actually about enhancing policy and building from it. This is what that planning policy would look like if it was laid out geographically. It's crazy. This is the land ownership. It's between the different planning authorities, the different public bodies, but also the private sector. I'm not going to go into it. And this was just a photo montage, just trying to talk about the different urban condition here. So you have the medieval street plan of the City of London, but then you have this thing that I've been talking about this big bit of infrastructure, which is the Inner Ring Road in London. What was really interested in researching the history of this place is that actually what we thought was a lost town centre, a void, actually had always been there. Well, not always been there, but it had been there since the Fire of London. This, well, you can see it on this drawing actually on the right better. So the red line is the wall, the old wall of the City of London, and there was an informal planning edict introduced after the Fire of London called the Field of Fire. The idea was that you would only have temporary buildings on the east side of the city wall as a fire defence, or a defence about lots of things. But anyway, there was basically, so what happened when Abercrombie came in 47 was actually he filled in the void, which was this informal planning edict. So I think it just emphasises the fact that sometimes when you dig deep and you dig deep and you dig deep, actually, it really reveals some of the patterns of this idea about grain and why places are what they are. So this is just about the existing gyratories, and then if it goes two way, what happens? We get a hectare of public realm. And what would the impact be of all this planning that's happening in terms of this big accelerated move of commercial development that's happening in this part of London in terms of the impact on the existing building heights and massing. And this is the development context. So I was talking yesterday about how pleased I was one of the projects was showing the development context, actually thinking about actually what's happening, what's in the planning pipeline. This was in 2008, we've just updated it. In 2008 it was even more crazy than this, and this is 2011. Land use. This is just really a bit of a headline. It is the cliff edge condition of the City of London, which is the commercial sector in blue, and this rather fragile residential community, which is the Bengali community, in the orange. And actually it's a cliff, it's a complete cliff. But then we like Nolly, so we look at Nolly plans a lot. So this is weekday lunchtime, so we start to look at the activity in the public realm on a weekday lunchtime. And what happens, an evening, sorry, it's got a typo, but the evening, the activity completely disappears off the street, and the crime statistics, because we always look at crime statistics, if you marry actually what happens in these different hours, the crime statistics exactly marry what happens in terms of the activity in the public realm. And then you have the Sunday street markets. This is really interesting. So then the demographic profile, probably one of the most interesting demographic profiles in the whole of the UK, because you've got 25% of the Bangladeshi community living right here, but you've also got the City of London's anti-terrorism squad sitting right there. So you've got this kind of symbolically, you've got this kind of standoff between misperceptions and ideas, really weird prejudices on either side right there, but the demographic profile is very important. And this is one of Philip Eveling's photographs. I think I showed it during the slideshow at the beginning. But this actually, in a way, an image can often sum up more than a drawing or more than any words. So this image represents the three economic models that are operating right here in the city fringe. We've got the Gherkin in the back, which is the insurance district of the City of London, these huge global floor plates, this massive scale of international business in the eastern part of the City of London. But you've also got the city fringe, which is these sort of younger, trendy creatives who've actually used the city fringe for the last 10, 15 years, really important business model that's operating very successfully in the city fringe. But you've also got these guys at the front. 85% of all business in Tower Hamlets employs 5 people or less, including Canary Wharf. So actually the idea that this is an incredible microcosm of independent run small businesses is also, so all three of these economic models are operating right here in right the same geographical location. And this photograph, in a way, I didn't need to say all of that because it sort of says it. So then the vision, this idea about what it could be. We worked with an architectural practice called Whitford Watson Mann on this. So the spine, so putting this back together across the cliff edge condition as one route, one high street. It always was one space, but actually putting it back as one space, this high street, is quite a big project in urban design terms, and these two planning authorities, it's quite hard work, but that's good. So the spine is the first thing. The second thing is that off the spine, 3 new civic spaces would hang. So actually, the one in the east, it actually already exists. It's called Atab Ali Park. It's an old graveyard. But 2 new spaces would be created out of what was highways. And then all the secondary routes. So actually, it's not just about this hierarchy of the primary routes, but the secondary routes. And then the fourth part is the pocket parks. So all of those four things together make a tabulation. We tabulated 33 projects. And this was then signed up by the three planning authorities in terms of actually what a 20-year vision would be about making a coherent public realm. And then the crash came. So interestingly, for me, this project is just being delivered now in 2011. It's been a bit of a mess because partly the credit crunch, but then also the City of London, who were one of the client group, the planning department, didn't tell anyone else in the City of London that they had this vision and this strategy. So the surveyors department in the City of London this year started a new master planning and visioning process with all the major landowners and developers who work locally. And some of the developers said to the chairman, we work with Publica, and didn't they do this a few years ago already? So then we had a whole 6 months of having to get the client, the two departments of the client, to recognise that actually, let's not duplicate all this work, let's actually just use what's useful and get on with it, kind of thing. This is the tabulation of projects. Some bot-offs, existing roadworks, indicative, I won't go into it, it's too much detail. The London Metropolitan University, we were arguing that if you look at the London School of Economics, it's in a little side street on Aldwych, but it feels like a campus. Well, why doesn't this university have any presence on the street? Maybe it could feel like a campus. Existing indicative or Castle Street. And then again, this kind of idea of what happens in terms of the Nolly plan if all of this was delivered in terms of a new neighbourhood. So this is weekday lunchtime, weekday evening, Sunday street markets. As you begin to see actually the pattern of actually what that meaningful activity is. This is a little film. I hope it's going to work. Works. So you kind of get the idea. We did it for an exhibition. We thought it was quite important to not show this big report and have to explain the whole planning strategy, but actually just do a few minutes of film that could speak to a number of different audiences. So we did that there was a big exhibition in Somerset House and the work we designed for London. And actually lots of things have happened. This is just opposite the Whitechapel Gallery, and this is what it used to look like. And then, oh my God, it's all a bit shiny and new, but all the buildings have been done up. And this is an Altab Valley Park. Muff Architects that were commissioned then to do a whole kind of revitalisation of this park. And we've been working, as I say, with London Metropolitan University. They're taking over the School of Art and Design in Aldgate. So actually we've done a whole series of walks. We're working with a particular unit there. We've done a whole series of lectures which are happening. This is one of the walks happening there. Another walk. This is the series of lectures. They're going on. The first one actually is tonight. I'm missing it. So we've got a whole series of practitioners, all these people that we've worked with over the years in Aldgate. I didn't really talk about the participative stuff that we did in Aldgate, but along the way, we found 2 troops of brownies. Do you all know what brownies are? These little girl guides. And there were 7-year-olds and 11-year-olds, all Bangladeshi girls, one African-Caribbean girl. They did our field work with us, for us, but we saw a completely different view of various housing estates because they showed us the super local condition of the stoops, literally, of their aunts and uncles, and where they understood this intimate relationship with this neighbourhood, which we would never ever have understood. So lots and lots of people that we've worked with over many, many years in this place, ranging from 7-year-olds right up to a whole series of different artists and practitioners. This is a really fantastic film. I recommend you look it up on the internet. It's called The Brilliant and the Dark, and it's from the Women's Library at London Metropolitan. There's an artist who, in fact, is speaking in a couple of Thursdays at the university, who we've worked with, who basically they take stuff out of the archive from the Women's Library and they reinterpret it. And this was an amazing performance piece for 1,000 female voices, first performed in 1969, and they've done a reinterpretation of it. This is a group who are also talking in the lecture series. They're called Haircut Before the Party. They've taken a disused shop and they offer free haircuts, okay? So you go and get a free haircut before you go out, great. And in return, you just have to have a conversation. And we love this organisation because it's about having conversations in public. And this idea, actually, that maybe you don't do this kind of quite hard work about doing consultation. Maybe actually it's about offering something back. This is the work we're doing with Lucinda Rogers with this particular unit at the university. I'm really concerned what's happened to architecture schools in the UK because the coalition government has cut the teaching grant for all art subjects, including architecture, by 100%. There is no teaching grant for any architecture school in the UK from next year. The danger of this is that architecture schools are going to become quite privileged places for affluent kids. Affluent people generally. And what they get taught at architecture school, I think, is really important because actually society more than ever needs engaged architects. So what Lucinda and I are doing is that we've got this unit which is about spatial planning, urban design, and all these students, and we've asked them to go and draw in public. So they've gone out and they've drawn Aldgate, and then this week they're in New York. So they've gone to London and they've gone to New York, and they have to go and draw in public. And we set them various things that they have to draw, different perspectives. And what's so interesting working with these students is that actually, when they come back, they've got these beautiful drawings, it's great, but actually they tell us about the conversations that they had. And actually one of the students said, when you take a photograph of a place, you take something away from a place. But when you do a drawing of a place and you're on site, everyone comes and leans over your shoulder and they want to find out what you're doing and they want to know why you're drawing it. And the idea that we don't have to design, or we don't have to find our information out from computers, that actually we are active agents and actually we are part of that public realm, I think is really important in terms of the skills that you as architects will bring to your profession. So that's why we're doing that. Okay, so this is I'm going to draw it to an end now, but we, along the way, we've been gathering lots and lots and lots of projects internationally from around many, many different places to try and find interesting case studies for ourselves. And we suddenly realized, in fact, somebody who worked for us, a very interesting woman who's living in Chile now, we had this big database of projects, and Justine Graham said, that would make a great book. Why don't you just put these case studies into a book? And then she introduced us to a publisher, Thames and Hudson, and they really wanted to do the book, so then we did the book and all the rest of it. So I was just going to tell you a little bit about the book. We found that there was what we suddenly realized was a new field of practice, because what we were interested in, the principles we were working to, was happening all over the world. It wasn't in 2007 when we researched and wrote this book, it wasn't really happening in the West, but actually I think it is a lot more now. So I'd be quite interested to maybe have that conversation in terms of how we feed this conversation, this sort of discussion about a live archive of how we learn about these projects. So this is the book. It's got a set of principles. It's about celebrating the local, set within the context of international best practice. It's about participative processes. It's about integrating social, cultural, spatial strategies to deliver long-term regeneration aims. And it's about exchange. It's about putting this good, hard, robust evidence base into the public domain as research and having a conversation around it and having a public conversation about it, which I think is really important. So we felt that it's happening around the world. It's these projects, they're very different in scale. So the ones that we chose and that we wrote about, some of them are huge pieces of a sub-regional planning strategy. Some of them are little pieces of architecture. Some of them are an educational project. They have nothing in common with each other, but they have lots in common with each other. The things that they have in common with each other is they're all transferable strategies, that actually people who are doing this kind of work are finding ways of sharing this information and using it as a resource and a platform to start having this conversation. I think it's having really important impact in terms of the way that architecture is taught and practiced internationally. It is about professional trespass. It's about none of the people in this book respect the professional boundaries that they have been trained to consider. So you have an artist who's building a bridge. You have an engineer who's doing an educational project. You have planners who are doing arts projects. Everybody is just not respecting the professional silos that have meant that the disciplines of engineering and planning and architecture have been so divided over so many years. They're cutting across all of that. They're trespassing. We really like it. They see renewal as continuous. They see the maximisation of resources as the critical factor. They see the significance of meaning within place as a basis, a thing, and it's all about long-term thinking. So, well, that's some of those words. So I don't know if you can read that, but anyway, yeah. It's just repeating what I've just said. Basically, it's they share a philosophy, is what I'm trying to say. And when we wrote this book, we got some really nice reviews. All these people said it was really great. We were really pleased. We kind of patted ourselves on the back, and we realised very quickly that actually the people we were trying to influence thought it was completely left field. You know what that means? It was fringe. It was this sort of nice to have conversation on the edge. It wasn't really going to change the world. And what happened then after 2007 was the credit crunch. And to our amazement, planning authorities started approaching us and asking us about how they could actually write into policy some of the things that we had in this book. And we thought that was really interesting. And then more interestingly, the private sector has now, like our guy who wants to do the 30-year meanwhile use, has started taking on board all of these things. And I think, it just emphasises what we were talking about yesterday, is that there's an extraordinary moment in history, and there is a really, really extraordinary moment that you should all be optimizing in terms of actually how practice is changing. I think that's really important. Okay, so just some categories. They're not all the categories in the book, but just some categories. Ideas about, this is all about open source. It's just about how you can use you doing it all the whole time, all your GIS stuff. It's just about how you can gather lots of information and share it. And actually, you see a campaign like Develop, Don't Destroy Brooklyn. It is stopping a massive master plan in Brooklyn. A massive issue that's been going on since 2003. It is changing the way that this top-down decision-making about master planning is happening, and it's happening because of open source. It's happening because actually we can share this information, that actually this idea between amateur and professional is massively blurring. So projects like Oasis in the US, Hotel Neustadt, you probably know these projects, but they've been around for years and they're now quite celebrated. This is called Children's Town. This architecture practice and a theatre group got 100 kids together in Essen, in former East Germany, and a very depleted residential community, so real shrinkage of a former city that was based around a chemical plant. And they asked the children of this place to start an idea of how the children would plan this town. And they decided to open a hotel. So they used one of the empty point blocks and turned it into a hotel, and they ran it as a summer festival. It was so successful that actually it attracted, I can't remember, like 250,000 people. The mayor of the city came and stayed in the hotel. It completely made people rethink this idea about the generations and about planning in Essen. These are the hotel rooms. And all this whole program of activity that they ran around the hotel. Clean India. This idea about advocacy, about young people being the agents of change around environmental measuring and policy within India. So this started off as a very small project. It's now in 35 cities in India. It provides all of the Delhi Secretariat's paper all comes from the Clean India children. rural studio, I'm sure you know, this idea about engaged practice in terms of actually what architects as citizens can provide as a process, infrastructure and utility. The Nelson Mandela Museum is in 3 sites in South Africa. He was very, very clear he didn't want an edifice. He didn't want this formal thing that everyone would go and say, oh, Nelson Mandela, he's great. He wanted to do something useful. So they all do, the 3 sites all do different things, but they're all about social infrastructure. They're all about meeting points, resources, water pumps. They're all about this idea about collective memory and collective future. Stanice in Slovakia, a sort of quite run-down suburban railway station. An artist group took it over and decided just to program all of their arts program on the trains. So now the ticket hall and the waiting room are part of this live museum. All this performance happens on the timetable, so actually the participants are just commuters. So thinking about infrastructure in a different way, this idea of layering infrastructure. Husbo Nord, I'm sure you know all about it. More people employed now there than when it was previously a steelworks. Visible Zagreb, a team of architects in terms of this idea about the cultural significance of post-war architecture in Zagreb in Croatia. And again about sort of this intervention acupuncturally about how actually you can start to put program in. Snow culture in Japan, I don't know if you know about this one. This is an amazing, really moving project. There was a small town which was losing its population. It's bound by snow for 6 months of the year. It was a big problem. No young people wanted to live there. It was all doom and gloom. And they decided to turn it into the Snowman Institute. So actually they decided to celebrate what they thought was the problem. Snow was the problem. They decided that maybe snow was the opportunity. So 40% of the population took 450 trucks to Tokyo, who never have snow, actually to have a snow festival. And then they started looking at all the different local biodiversity in terms of all the food that was grown in this particular region and all the different cultural traditions, and they built the Snowman Institute, which is powered by, they store all the snow, and they've got all these really smart technologies about architecture and snow. And now all these people want to come and live in this town because it's a new approach to planning and identity. Sorry, that's the Snowman Institute. It's in the shape of a snowman. It's really sweet. And this is the snow, collecting the snow. So I think I just wanted to finish off, it's just repeating the principles that I talked about before. And I think what I just wanted to end up saying is that what we're attempting to do, particularly with our research unit, with our work with the university, London Metropolitan in London, what we're trying to do with our projects is build and contribute to this debate about policy, about the tools and about the debate. And in 20 or 50 years' time, what we build, how we build, whom we build for, and what we do with the existing stock will all change. That is a given. DIY regeneration, I believe, is the future. It involves more people in governance and decision making. It's more just, it's more flexible, it has a long-term goal. We have a Nils Norman. Nils Norman's this fantastic artist. He gave us one of his pictures. We've got this beautiful picture of Nils Norman in our office, and it says, in the future, all your neighbours will be architects. And we always joke about it. Is that a threat or a promise? I think it's a promise. I think it's very good. But I think that the definition, this broader definition of architecture, is what architecture needs. And I think all of you, in terms of setting the agenda for how you make that broader definition of architecture and who is involved and what you do with these methods and these tools and these debates, is what our societies really, really need. So no pressure, it's up to you. Thank you very much. To be honest, it's not necessarily us approaching developers. Developers come and knock on our door because they think they've got a problem. And I think the problem has been a slightly different problem over the last 10 years, but the problem has been about mixed-use policy. Actually, people knew how to deliver office buildings, commercial development, or they were house builders and they knew how to do residential development, but they didn't really necessarily know how to do mixed use. And what was coming about was these actually, because of something called the Urban Task Force in Britain, the government changed the policy on brownfield land around transport interchanges. So there was much, much greater intensification around key kind of transport nodes, and this was a big move. And what happened was everyone was exploiting it. They were making these tiny little rabbit hutches of apartments, I mean, just crazy. And they had this boarded up ground floor because they couldn't sell the retail offer. So actually it was developers who had a problem, who knew that they didn't want to have a boarded up ground floor, and they did want to have something that would sell and would mean something, and they didn't really necessarily know how to do it. So actually were you talking about the Aldgate project, the hectare of public realm? So there is a blurring between what is publicly owned and what is privately owned, but I think that people have begun to recognise there's a very insidious process of sterilising and making corporate the public realm, which we can see in Paternoster Square as a very extreme example of it, but there's lots and lots and lots of spaces which just become about the lobby of a building and a bit of their front door, and they're not connected in any meaningful way in terms of who uses it, how they use it, when they use it, what the identity of the space is, and it doesn't feel public. So this, I think, has been why there has been an appetite in the private sector to come and find us to say, how do we do it? So it's not just about people giving over their land and say, Lucy, go and do something pretty and sweet and soft and nice over there. It's actually more about their business model. That it hasn't been working very well, and they sort of know they have to do things differently, and they don't necessarily know what to do. And our emphasis is about the brief. It's about the brief for the master plan, it's about the brief for the architects, it's the brief for the landscape architects. We're really interested in setting the right brief, and that's my point about making sure that the brief has to be participative to be a really kind of true and useful vehicle. And a lot of architects we work for or with really like this process. They like a brief that is this evidence base. But some architects don't, and I'm not going to name any names, but some really big architects do not like it at all, because they are used to setting the agenda and telling their clients exactly what happens in terms of different spaces and different hierarchical spaces. So I think that it's not, I wouldn't want you to think it's just at the largesse of the client, the private sector, that they give over something a little bit that's a bit more touchy-feely. It's not really about that. I think it's a different way of building the city. It's a kind of reality check in terms of what are we doing with the city. I mean, the guy who wants us to look at his 10-year-old commercial development, he's tearing his hair out because he knows he's got real competition in London. People have built things like King's Cross Central is being built out at the moment, Regent's Place is, all these places that are more urban, more interesting, they have more life in them, they're more interesting architecturally. He knows that he won't get his big corporate headquarters to come to his place anymore because he's got a lot of competition. And he's saying to me, this typology of building didn't exist 10 years ago. I was the first one to do these 20, 30, 40-storey towers. But now they're happening all over London. So actually people have a lot of choice now. Well, how can I be different? How can I mark myself as distinctive? So it's business, as is normally the case in terms of change.
So you quoted Change Act for several times, and I just wanted to know, are there any more contemporary must-read texts that you would advise?
Lots. We make a bit of an art form of trying to find older texts, because I'm quite interested in. There's a often repeated history in planning and architecture, where people, and I had to say it's usually women, who have written or acted in terms of research in urbanism, who have been completely marginalised. And actually, if we look back at them, so there are people like Irene Barclay. I don't know if you wouldn't necessarily know her. She's British. She was the first female qualified surveyor in Britain in the 1920s. She was very critical of the boundary housing estate, the first social housing built in London, because it wasn't, in terms of replacing the slums, it wasn't replacing the housing stock with enough units to be able to offer the full community new accommodation. There had to be a lowering of the density, the LCC said. And she strongly opposed this because she said that actually what you need to do is, and this was in the 1920s, you need to layer social program into higher density neighbourhoods to be able to retain the social infrastructure and the social networks. So maybe on the roof you ought to have luncheon clubs for elderly people, and you ought to have gardening clubs, here, and you ought to have holiday clubs, and you ought to have, creches, and you ought to have, after school clubs, and you ought to have sport, and all of this has to happen in the housing estate, but it has to happen with 100% reoccupation of the redeveloped land rather than 80% or 70% or 60%, which is what the LCC was doing. So we're very interested in the historical surveying. What she did, unlike the desk-based surveying of the LCC, is she went and she spoke to people, and she went on site and just every single house, she started looking at the occupation of different districts in all cities all around England. So Irene Barclay, Elizabeth Denby, another British academic, in 1937, she went and did a survey of European housing. She got a small grant to do it. The book that she wrote, it's called Europe Rehoused in 1937, is, I'm not kidding you, it is exactly the same structure and issues that the Urban Task Force in 1997 for the British government wrote. I know for a fact, because I know a lot of people on the Urban Task Force, none of them had read Elizabeth Denby, but she'd written it for them in 1937. One of the key things that she was saying was actually that in Britain we've got more subsidy around housing and a lower quality of stock that we're delivering through new architecture than anywhere else in Europe at lower densities. So lots and lots of issues that she was coming up with. So Elizabeth Denby's works really well, really interesting. Jane Jacobs' work, really interesting. Personally interested in things like situationists and a whole series of things. In terms of more recent stuff, I suppose we spend so long trying to pull these women out of history and say, actually, if you put it all together, this is a really interesting critique of the ideas about urban planning, and this is the century and the generation that has to mainstream this and take it seriously, rather than, marginalising and sort of compromising it. So it's partly about history, but it's also trying to find people. Lots of practitioners that we work with now are doing exactly the same in terms of these live archives and so forth.
Well, I just bought a book. I want to contribute, maybe. I just bought a book that is called Personal Urban Interventions. It's a thick book, just full of images, so not very theoretical, but it's just collecting a whole bunch, maybe 1,000 projects or something like this, of very, very, very small interventions done by single people. Or, very, very small organizations or so. So people that have, for example, painted something on the floor. People that have put a little sensor here and there. People that have tweaking, almost like micro kind of interventions. Yeah, they have produced much greater change. So it's very bottom up, not top down. That might be also something that we want to look at, because it's really absolutely fantastic.
It would be very easy to pull together that bibliography for you, and I'm sure we can help do that. And it would be really good if anyone's interested in sharing it, adding to it.
Any other question? I would like to make a final comment if you are okay, just to connect to what I saw yesterday. Maybe that helps a little bit.
There's a question.
Huh?
There's a question.
Okay.
Hi.
Question.
I'm curious because a lot of the sites that you show seem to be spaces where they're starting from scratch, like you're saying, and surrounding these areas, there's like a pretty diverse sort of atmosphere that's happening, charged in some way. But have you done any sort of projects where you're working on a space which often is sort of the opposite, where there's not that diversity, there's not
Yeah, I mean, I chose to do kind of urban sites, but we've worked on some bigger regional strategies. There was a big project that we did in a place called Thurrock in the Thames Gateway, where the central government had basically identified this as an area of growth for the whole of the UK, and it was seen as a very discounted place. It was seen as the sort of New Jersey of the UK. You know, you kind of travel through it. It's the place where all the docks are and the logistics are and do redistribution. And we decided there, we were actually asked, slightly not answering your question, but we were asked to do a conference for a whole group of regional agencies and the planning authority and everything. They wanted to have people like Renzo Piano and people come and talk in Thurrock about a different approach to architecture and planning. And we were asked to respond to staging this conference, and we said that is a really bad idea. If you get these sorts of practitioners to come and talk, they're going to talk about their own work in another part of the world. They're not going to talk about this place. And actually, wouldn't it be more interesting to do an atlas of maps and actually to begin to work through getting some people to work in Thurrock, so doing a series of charrettes. So we chose our 20 favourite people internationally, our A-list, our AAA list, and to our amazement, they all came. So we did 3 charrettes. So we had architects, planners, environmentalists and artists. They all had to come for 3 days and work there. We'd done this whole atlas of maps, and we were led by, we did 3 artist commissions, very subjective commissions about these places. We set the brief for the charrettes, and then we got local people to be the technical jury to actually take us on walks and so forth. So actually, it's not really answering your question. But I suppose that's one extreme of sub-regional strategy in terms of master planning. There's others where actually that there is consensus that nothing should change, because actually there's some of the historic great estates. So London was laid out in the 18th century in the West End through these, it's called the Great Estates, and places where people feel passionately about not having any change. And we're working for quite a lot of the great estates who really, really want to think about how they can respect this architectural heritage and their constituents in terms of all these stakeholders, but actually change things subtly in terms of the civic role of a neighbourhood, in terms of the retail strategy, in terms of some of the residential strategies, etc., etc. So there's always, even in discounted Thurrock, or in a big master plan on a former railway land, or in right in the historic heart of London, there's always, we think, things that we can find out that can prove the absolute critical thread to building the right brief. And I suppose that's what I'm trying to say, is it's not necessarily about scale or about dragging stuff in from the edges. It's just about having that sensitivity and that intelligence base to be able to have a conversation about what the brief is. Does that help?
Have you ever realized a project or a consultant project in which something different happened than what you expected? I don't know, like sometimes as planners, we expect people to go to parks and maybe do some kind of activity, but we're not sure. Have you ever realized that something really different happened from what you planned or expected?
I think of a good example of that. Yes, I'm sure, because we're always looking for surprise. We're looking for people to surprise us. We're looking for things that we don't recognise immediately, but that we will only recognise through this intense immersion. There are lots of public spaces that we have worked on. In the film, there was one called Bram Street. It was the craziest place to put a new park. So they took this road out. We said to the mayor's office, don't put a park here. There are no routes through it. Nobody feels ownership of this space. It's crazy. But the proposal that we did put forward was that because there are more young people in that neighbourhood than anywhere else in the UK in terms of the demographic profile, and there's less public space or leisure or sports facility than anywhere in the UK, let's turn it into the A of the A to B of this High Street 2012, this idea about the route to the Olympics. And it could become this provocative thing all about sport, whereby people begin to become familiar with this space and actually use it as an amenity, and then actually when you want to then deliver this lovely park, people will feel there's a reason to go there because you'll reuse some of this infrastructure. They didn't listen to us for one moment. They just did the park. The park hasn't had a single person in it. There's no reason for anyone. There doesn't even get any sunlight, this park. It's surrounded by tall buildings, and it's just got lots of rubbish in it. It's just really sad. So I think I don't want to say, oh, we're so clever. We identified this, but I think that the point about all the evidence is to think long and hard about the reality check. A lot of architects' visualizations for our clients show this cappuccino drinking world with all these lovely, spaces. It's total bullshit. It's about a hope value rather than actually understanding what's the reality of what happens on a winter's bleak, damp, London, grey, gritty, polluted afternoon. Actually, what's the reality check rather than this kind of smokes and mirrors. All architects do it. It's just, and the architects that we love working with and love working with us, actually, I think we're beginning to change this idea about communications and visualizations and ideas about how you convey ideas and so forth, and how you get, how you're open to surprise as well as anticipating what some of the pitfalls are.
There was one more.
Well, to speak about the appropriation of people, the space appropriation by people, the fact that they feel comfortable in the place and home, kind of speak about this kind of use as a way to say how to develop this at a urban scale. These people saw about the personal involvement of some project that people are really involved in this thing. And as an urban planner, how do you imagine the urban space to be able to evolve with all this, how to stimulate this involvement of the people, how to stimulate, I would say, flexibility to let people appropriate the space and manage involvement?
I think that what you were talking about, Marta, in terms of the significance of the small action, actually is really, really powerful. I think personally, because I used to run a thing which was equivalent to an architecture centre, I believe passionately in this idea that actually you can have a neutral and critical debate in public about bigger issues of the city than just about small spaces. Ultimately, I think you need that space for... I did it in London for a time. I used the Stadtforum in Berlin as a model to see what would happen to London in the absence of a planning authority to this great city, London. It was absolutely electric what happened. We got 15,000 people that came to these debates. It was incredible. And a whole series of policies at central government and at city government changed because of those public debates. There were lots of reasons why that happened, so I'm not dismissing the fact that it can't happen on a much larger scale, but I think it is about facilitation of that debate. And I don't think it happens unless it's curated and that somebody can facilitate that debate. But I also think that the reality on the ground is these petits projets, these tiny, tiny little but very powerful actions, which is about the city in flux. And I think the problems that we've got is about this new amplified scale of the shiny buildings that have no flexibility and won't allow for appropriation. And I suppose not that it's totally pertinent, but it's pertinent to me emotionally. In the book, we talk about an artist called Lara Amalsaqui, and she wanted, in the docklands of Rotterdam, making vast amounts of development happening at this accelerated pace in terms of the new use of the former docks. She did an art piece which is called Dock Wasteland. And Dock Wasteland, she bought a piece of wasteland, and she wanted, the idea is that in perpetuity, forever, this thing is a piece of wasteland that actually we need to leave space. We don't need to design and have answers for everything at every scale. Actually, there's a thing about collective memory, about what former industrial sites were and what that means in terms of collective memory. So I think that actually, I don't want you to think that we're just trying to program the whole city, because you can see, I mean, I was talking to Nota before about the London's damp, it's grey, some of the images I was showing at the beginning, it's palpable, kind of the dampness of London. But actually, London's landscape, the Michael Collins images, I think are absolutely beautiful. And so actually the idea about, aesthetics in here and, decision making and so forth, I think we need to tread lightly. But boldly. Sorry?
I wanted to maybe here outside and we can continue the conversation. Thank you.